Imagine it, Christmas Day, 1521. While Spanish colonists on the island of Hispaniola prepared to celebrate, enslaved Africans in Santo Domingo were preparing for something far more dangerous, a rebellion. Armed with stolen tools and fueled by desperation, they rose up against the very system that had shackled them. It was the first recorded slave revolt in the Americas, decades before the Haitian Revolution, centuries before the United States was even founded. The setting was deceptively small, a sugar plantation just outside Santo Domingo. But the event sent tremors through the Spanish Empire. Here, for the first time in the New World, enslaved Africans declared with action, not words, "We will not remain silent. We will resist." The uprising was brutally suppressed, yet its significance cannot be erased. In this single moment, the myth of total colonial control cracked. The Spanish planters realized their new world was built on unstable ground, and that those forced into chains carried both the will and the courage to fight back. This revolt did not succeed, but it lit the first spark in a centuries-long fire of resistance across the Caribbean and the Americas. From Santo Domingo in 1521 to Jamaica, Guyana, and ultimately Haiti, the story of slave resistance is not one of silence, it is one of defiance. Today, we revisit the forgotten rebellion that started it all. The Santo Domingo Slave Revolt of 1521, the first uprising against slavery in the Americas. The year was 1521, and the Spanish colony of Santo Domingo stood as the crown jewel of Spain's first conquests in the Americas. Gold had drawn the conquistadors, but sugar was now king. Plantations stretched across Hispaniola's fertile valleys, cane fields waved in the wind, their sweetness bound for European tables. But beneath the prosperity lay endless suffering. Enslaved Africans had begun arriving only decades earlier, brought to replace indigenous labor devastated by disease and violence. These men and women were uprooted from West Africa, torn from homes, cultures, and languages. For the Spanish colonists, Africans were tools, forced laborers whose strength would fuel empire. For the Africans themselves, the colony was a prison from which they longed to break free. Daily life on the plantations was unrelenting. From sunrise to sunset, enslaved men cut cane, women carried loads, and children tended fires in the boiling houses. Whips cracked, sweat poured, and punishment was swift for the faint of heart. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion took lives as quickly as machetes cut cane. Death was so common that replacements were continually imported. To the Spanish, Africans were numbers. To themselves, they remained human, remembering freedom. This imbalance was volatile. By the 1520s, Santo Domingo had more enslaved Africans than Europeans. A thin colonial elite ruled by fear, but fear is a fragile foundation. The colonists believed they controlled the island. In reality, they were sitting atop a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. Whispers of unrest were already moving through the fields of Santo Domingo long before 1521. Every blow of the overseer's whip, every stolen life, planted not submission, but fury. The enslaved Africans on Hispaniola were not blank slates. Many came from regions of West Africa where warfare, statecraft, and resistance were part of lived experience. Some had been soldiers before being captured, trained in tactics and the discipline of combat. Even those who had never held weapons carried something equally powerful, the memory of freedom. They remembered villages where families ate together, sang together, and lived under skies unbroken by chains. At night, in the barracks or hidden corners of the cane fields, men and women whispered in languages the overseers could not understand. Songs carried hidden meanings. Drumming rhythms, though forbidden, echoed quietly, sending signals from one group to another. The Spanish colonists, arrogant and confident, underestimated the enslaved. They saw them only as laborers, never as thinkers. But in truth, strategy was already forming in minds hardened by suffering. The timing of rebellion mattered. The conspirators watched the patterns of their masters, waiting for a moment when vigilance was lowest. And what day could be more vulnerable than Christmas? While the colonists feasted, drank, and prayed, the enslaved would rise. The plan was simple, yet daring. To strike suddenly, overwhelm the few armed guards, and turn tools of labor into weapons of defiance. Machetes meant for cane could just as easily cut chains. The revolt was not born of desperation alone, it was born of courage, the belief that even in a strange new world, freedom was worth the risk of death. For the Africans of Santo Domingo, life in bondage was no life at all. Better to fight and fall than to labor endlessly for the empire that had stolen them. And so, the seeds were sown. By December of 1521, the whispers of rebellion had grown into a fire. The first great test of slavery in the Americas was about to explode. The morning of December 25th began like any other for the enslaved. Cane still needed cutting, fires still needed tending. But beneath the surface, tension burned hotter than the boiling houses. For the Spanish colonists, Christmas meant feasting and prayer. They gathered in homes decorated with candles, their tables heavy with roasted meat, sweet cakes, and imported wine. Their laughter echoed through streets and across fields. Yet, in the quarters of the enslaved, no such joy was shared. There, whispered words replaced carols. Hands gripped machetes not as tools, but as weapons. Every glance carried a secret. The conspirators had chosen their moment well. The colony's overseers were distracted, their guards relaxed. The air was thick with a false sense of peace. To the enslaved, it was the silence before the storm. When the first blow fell, it came swiftly. An overseer, surprised in his drunken state, crumpled to the ground beneath a strike of iron. His musket was seized before he could even cry out. Chaos erupted across the plantation. Enslaved men and women surged forward, turning cane knives into blades of war. Torches were lifted high, flames licking at the night sky as huts and storehouses began to burn. The cries of rebellion cut through the holiday hymns. Spanish families, once secure in their wealth, now cowered behind shuttered doors. The colony's illusion of control shattered in an instant. In the fields, enslaved warriors fought with desperation and unity. Chains clanged as bonds were broken. For the first time in the Americas, Africans rose not as laborers, but as soldiers demanding freedom. The revolt spread quickly, threatening to consume the plantation like fire racing through dry cane. Word leapt from estate to estate. Everywhere, the enslaved saw a chance to rise. For the colonists, panic set in. Bells rang in alarm, summoning soldiers and militias. But fear clouded their response. How many rebels were there? How far had the plot spread? The island trembled on the edge of transformation. On that Christmas day, Santo Domingo was no longer simply Spain's colony. It had become a battlefield. This was not just a rebellion of bodies. It was a rebellion of memory, of pride, of the unshakable belief that freedom belonged to all. And though the revolt would soon face the might of the Spanish Empire, in that moment the enslaved Africans of Santo Domingo had achieved something profound. They had made history. The fires of rebellion lit up the night sky, but by dawn the Spanish colonists were ready to respond. Word of the uprising raced through Santo Domingo like a fever. Soldiers and settlers rushed to arms, muskets primed, swords unsheathed. The colonial authorities wasted no time. Bells tolled in the capital, calling militias to gather. Clergymen thundered from pulpits, declaring the revolt not just treason, but a sin against God's chosen order. Fear and faith fused into fury. The rebels had struck with courage, but the Spanish held a brutal advantage. They had horses, firearms, and a network of fortified towns. Against machetes and torches, gunpowder spoke with deadly force. As militias rode out into the countryside, smoke still curled from burning cane. The rebels fought fiercely, striking in ambush, retreating into the fields, but the colonists pressed harder, their volleys cutting through the air with thunderous finality. Villages of the enslaved were raided. Anyone suspected of joining the plot was seized. Mothers clutched children as soldiers dragged husbands away. Chains clinked once more, this time not as tools of labor, but as punishment for defiance. Those who resisted were struck down. Muskets tore through gatherings, while swords flashed in the sun. Horses trampled the wounded. The revolt that had begun with fire was now smothered in blood. Leaders of the rebellion were singled out. Some were captured alive, paraded before terrified crowds. Others were executed on the spot, their bodies left on display to warn against future uprisings. The Spanish crown's representatives made an example of the conspiracy. Gallows rose in public squares. Whips cracked until screams became silence. The message was clear. Rebellion would not be tolerated in Spain's new empire. Yet, even in defeat, the courage of the rebels could not be erased. They had fought against impossible odds, facing the most powerful empire of their time. For a brief moment, they had shaken the foundations of Spanish rule. The revolt was crushed, but the fear it created lingered. The colonists would never again feel entirely secure. Behind every cane stalk, they imagined whispers of defiance waiting to rise again. The rebellion of 1521 had been crushed, but the island of Hispaniola would never be the same. Though the Spanish reasserted their rule, they could not erase the memory of fire and defiance. The colony had seen its first great fracture, and scars remained. In the weeks following the uprising, Santo Domingo's plazas turned into theaters of punishment. Executions were staged publicly, designed to terrify the enslaved population into silence. Some rebels were hanged, their bodies left swaying in the tropical breeze. Others were broken on wheels, their agony drawn out for all to witness. The church played its role as well. Priests stood beside magistrates, declaring the revolt an affront to divine order. From pulpits, they warned that God himself demanded obedience, and that disobedience would lead to eternal damnation as surely as earthly death. Faith was twisted into another chain. Yet even terror was not enough. The Spanish crown realized that military might alone could not secure its colonies. Laws would be needed, rules designed to strip away every possibility of resistance before it could take root again. In January 1522, new slave codes were issued in Santo Domingo. These laws restricted movement, forbade gatherings of enslaved people, and placed harsh limits on African cultural practices. Drumming, night assemblies, and traveling without permission were all banned. What had once been traditions of unity became criminal acts. Masters were granted even broader authority to punish, to surveil, and to prevent conspiracies. Informants were rewarded, trust was fractured. The enslaved were forced into isolation, their every step monitored. These codes became a model for future colonies across the Americas. From the Caribbean to Mexico to Peru, the logic of 1522 spread: fear, control, and suppression. The Spanish believed they had found a formula to prevent another Santo Domingo. But history would prove otherwise. For every law written in Madrid, for every gallows raised in the colonies, the will to resist survived. The conspiracy of 1521 had been silenced, but the desire for freedom remained unbroken. The revolt's aftermath hardened the colony into a garrison society, an island where fear ruled both enslaved and enslaver alike. The Spanish thought they had secured peace. In reality, they had planted deeper seeds of defiance. The Spanish Empire was careful with its history. Official chronicles of conquest celebrated victories, treasures, and conversions. They did not celebrate uprisings of the enslaved. The revolt of 1521, though shocking at the time, was quickly buried under silence. Colonial officials reduced the event to cold phrases: a disturbance subdued, or mutiny punished. The voices of the rebels were never recorded, their names, their dreams, their courage, all erased from parchment. Planters feared the power of memory. If word of the revolt spread too widely, it might inspire others. Better to hide it, to pretend it had never truly threatened the colony. Silence became a weapon just as powerful as muskets. Yet memory is not so easily erased. Among the enslaved themselves, stories lingered. Around fires at night, elders whispered fragments of men who struck back, of women who carried courage, of chains broken even if only briefly. These stories lived in song, in rhythm, in quiet nods passed down generations. The Spanish could ban drumming, but they could not stop hearts from remembering. The act of telling became an act of resistance. For the descendants of those rebels, the memory served as proof. We have never been passive. Even in the earliest days of slavery in the Americas, Africans had already risen to demand freedom. In European archives, the revolt was a footnote. In African memory, it was a spark. Two histories running parallel, one written in ink to suppress, the other carried in blood to survive. This tension between silence and remembrance defined the legacy of 1521. The Spanish Empire tried to bury the story, but like seeds hidden underground, memory waited for the right season to rise again. The Santo Domingo Slave Revolt of 1521 may have been crushed, but its echoes traveled far beyond the walls of the plantation where it began. It marked the first time in the Americas that enslaved Africans rose openly against colonial rule. That fact alone reshaped the psychology of empire. For the Spanish, the rebellion planted a seed of fear. No matter how firmly they claimed dominion, they knew now that their subjects were not passive laborers. Every new shipment of enslaved Africans was viewed with suspicion. To the colonists, each face from the ships carried not only strength but also danger. The revolt forced colonial officials to think differently about power. They built more forts, stationed more soldiers, and enacted stricter codes of surveillance. The empire's obsession with control, laws, punishments, prohibitions, grew directly out of the terror of 1521. Yet the harder they tried to impose silence, the more they revealed their own fragility. Among the enslaved, the legacy was the opposite. Though names and details blurred with time, the memory of resistance lived on. The story of Santo Domingo was retold in fragments, about Africans who struck their masters, about flames that licked the night sky, about freedom dared for, even if denied. These fragments gave strength to later generations. In Jamaica, rebels like Taki would rise with the same conviction more than 2 centuries later. In South America, the Berbice Revolt would echo the same defiance. And in Haiti, the most famous of all uprisings, enslaved Africans turned defiance into revolution, an achievement foreshadowed by Santo Domingo in 1521. Historians now see the revolt not as an isolated event, but as the opening chapter of a larger saga. From the Caribbean to Brazil, from Louisiana to Colombia, every uprising carried the same pulse. Freedom was worth any risk. The Santo Domingo rebels were the first to prove it on American soil. Even the colonists could not escape the legacy. Their constant fear, their obsession with punishments, their fortified towns, all were monuments to that Christmas night when Africans dared to rise. Fear reshaped their world as much as rebellion had reshaped the enslaved. Today, the legacy of 1521 is more than a story of defeat. It is a reminder that resistance is older than empire, and that every generation of enslaved people carried within them the memory of those who fought first. They were not shadows in the background of history. They were its authors. The spark lit in Santo Domingo smoldered for centuries, and when the great flames of Haiti blazed in 1791, one could say the fire had been waiting since 1521. The Santo Domingo Revolt of 1521 was short, brutal, and ultimately suppressed, yet its true power lies not in its immediate outcome, but in its enduring meaning. It was the first declaration on American soil that slavery would not go unchallenged. For centuries, European archives tried to minimize it. They wrote of order restored, of rebellion subdued. But silence does not erase truth. The uprising lives on as the earliest pulse of freedom in the New World. To the Spanish colonists, it was a nightmare, proof that their empire rested on fragile ground. To the enslaved Africans, it was proof of dignity, that even in the harshest conditions, people could rise, resist, and refuse to be broken. Every later revolt carried its spirit. From St. John in 1733 to Jamaica in 1760, from Berbice in 1763 to Haiti in 1791, the defiance of Santo Domingo's rebels whispered across generations. Resistance is possible, freedom is worth the fight. This was more than a local incident. It was the opening note of a centuries-long symphony of rebellion that would shake the Atlantic world. The rebels of 1521 did not live to see freedom, but they gave history its first proof that the enslaved would never remain silent. Their story, long buried in colonial silence, demands to be remembered. It is not a footnote. It is a beginning. The first revolt in the Americas belongs not to the empire that tried to hide it, but to the people who dared to ignite it. The revolt of 1521 in Santo Domingo was more than a fleeting act of defiance. It was the first voice of freedom in the Americas, a declaration that slavery would never go unchallenged. Though crushed, it lit a spark that carried forward into every uprising that followed. Stories like this remind us that history is not only written by the victors. It is also carried by the whispers of the oppressed, by the courage of those who dared to resist. Remembering them keeps their struggle alive. If this story moved you, don't let it vanish into silence. Share it, so others can hear the voices that history tried to erase. Subscribe to this channel for more forgotten stories of rebellion, resistance, and survival from slavery's dark past. And as you leave, remember this truth: freedom was never given, it was always fought for. Let us honor those who fought by ensuring their courage is never forgotten.